So what is it that happened just about 2,000 years ago that we still gather to remember, pay homage to? What could have lasted that long? We will hear the story. Many of us, most of us, if not all of us, know something of the story. That's why we're here. We know that Jesus was betrayed, beaten, mocked, and crucified. But why? And I'd like to pose the question or the thought that you have a friend who's a person who doesn't follow Jesus, who's not a Christ follower, really holds no animosity towards the faith, but is maybe we would call Christian curious these days. And were they to ask you, well, why would God send a son to be killed? Doesn't sound very Christian to me. It's not often that we talk theology these days, much within the church. I'm afraid our founder, John Wesley, would have a rather small parish because he lent heavily into it. So I'd like to express a couple different thoughts in that vein. So one of the historical ways of understanding is that we are prisoners of sin, that there was no way we could get out of jail free. We couldn't land on that square over in the Monopoly board. And so God sent Jesus to be our bailiff. Jesus gives his life in exchange for ours. He dies, we go free. Now, there's a lot of reasons why this has been such a commonly accepted explanation over the years. It resonates with the Passover at which was taking place. Now, Jesus didn't just happen to come at the time he did. He was there for one of the many Jewish holidays, and it was the holiday of Passover, the time when the Jews celebrated when the 10th and final plague was taking place in Egypt. And excuse me. And the firstborn of all the Egyptians died, and then Pharaoh had said, all right, I know I've told you a couple times I would let you go, but this time I'm really going to do it because the people are tired of what's been going on around here. And so they had this great celebration of their release from captivity, hundreds of years of captivity in Egypt. And so it was a big blowout celebration. It is then that Jesus goes in. Part of that celebration was a sacrificial lamb whose life was given in order to save the life of God's people. And it fits other motifs as well that we don't really have time to get into or explain to tonight for lack of time. But if you want to impress your imaginary or perhaps real friend that you're having this conversation with, that the word there is substitutionary atonement. In other words, Jesus was substituted, his death substituted for our death. They say, well, why did anybody have to die? Well, that's because the God that we understand as being holy and just, right? So his holiness is what brings about his compassion, but his justice side demands an accounting for the sins which we have been engaged with, created along with. Pick whatever language you want there. So I'm giving you the historical context. I want to remind you of that. So in the eyes of the holy God, there are messes to which we have contributed, messes that are beyond our capacity or our ability to clean up, but someone has to atone for. In other words, we don't have what it takes to make things right. It is beyond us, beyond our capabilities to do so. So it's left to God. And so sometimes, excuse me. Sometimes this is called, in less theological language, the bailout theory of theology of the cross. So now, while this understanding or approach to the cross dots a lot of I's and crosses a lot of T's, it also raises some troublesome issues. One that your friend might have mentioned. Doesn't sound very loving to me. So several things can be true at the same time. It is my understanding and belief that God is the only one who can save us and redeem us individually and corporately. But where I and others take issue with the idea that the God who in our understanding is the embodiment of love and mercy would be so cruel as to intentionally send and sacrifice his only son, especially when we see in the older Testament story how God spared Abram and Isaac from such a similar fate years before. So I think about it this way. I don't see why God would intentionally bring violence and brutality and injustice to the world, to his son, of all things. For we see so much else where God labors to save the world from all those things. Now, I know the response from those who are firmly committed to that rather strict substitutionary atonement approach, and where that ensuing conversation would go, but again, time is what it is tonight. It seems to me that the God of love and mercy would not be a bloodthirsty God who requires the blood of Jesus to let everyone off the hook. So one way of looking at it, this, which was powerful to me, was the thought that if this were the case, that Jesus had to die in this way. Now, mind you, it's a very important distinction. There's a difference between God knowing it and God directing it. Between knowing and directing, okay? A big difference. So if for the moment we say that out of the sacrificial model that Jesus had to die in the manner which we understood him to have died on Good Friday, then the Roman soldiers who hung him on the cross were doing God's work. And for me, that was a line I just could never cross. To think that God would instruct somehow in the annals of time 4, 5, how many ever it took, to hang him on that tree, to pierce his wrists so that he would slowly asphyxiate over the coming hours. That was one thought that I wrestled with. After all, our God is the God of whom the psalmist writes, "You have no delight in sacrifice. If I were to give you a burnt offering, you would not be pleased. The sacrifice acceptable to God is a broken spirit, a broken and contrite heart, O God, you will not despise. So what happened on this day all those years ago, if it was not some kind of cosmic payoff? Well, may I suggest one way to think about it is that Jesus is the embodiment of God's grace and mercy, the embodiment of God's love and justice. And he willingly gave up his life instead of giving in. Gave up rather than giving in to the powers that wanted him to conform, to be quiet, to go quietly, to stop protesting. And Jesus had a choice to make, much like you and I do. Jesus gave up his life instead of giving in. He gave up his solidarity instead of giving up his solidarity with the poor and the oppressed. Jesus was innocent. He was like that sacrificial lamb. See, there are many overlaps here. He was like that sacrificial lamb. And on this day, Jesus' only crime was telling the truth. And sometimes it's asked, well, how did the big switch happen? Well, Jesus became bolder and bolder in his teachings between Palm Sunday and Good Friday in what he was willing to confront the powers to be. So he was executed by the state. The death penalty, something Jesus spoke out against. So on this day, the gentle lamb was slain. We don't talk much about lambs these days, but in Jesus' day, they were commonly understood to be the purest animal that one could make as a sacrifice to God. So how can this great tragedy have any good in it? Someone asked me, well, why do we call this day good? What good could possibly come out of such violence? Now, that's not to say that we can't say things like Jesus died for us or Jesus died for you, but rather there's a subtle but important difference. You say Jesus died for love of you because he would not give up for you. He would not give up on you. Over in John, he says, I'll never leave you nor forsake you. Jesus died out of a love that led him to courageously stand up to all the things of this world that would do you harm. And so we can talk about some of the saints whose names we may remember, Desmond Tutu or Martin Luther King Jr., or I was reminded, not too long ago of the two black aldermen in Nashville who simply welcomed the protesters who were protesting, those who had members in their townships in Nashville area killed by guns, and simply welcomed in those who were protesting gun violence, and they were voted out the next day by the majority white Senate or Congress there in Tennessee. Jesus died out of a love for you that led him to courageously stand up to all the things of this world that poison the mind, those things that are harder, and those things that harden your heart, those things that tempt us to worship other idols. For all those things that steal your life, because Jesus' love for us, he didn't back down from what threatens us, even when he knew it would threaten his life. And it did cost him his. So what happened on this day all those years ago was that Jesus became our ultimate guide. Those who love me will follow me. The one who shows us what it looks like to be fully human, as God intended. To stand up and not back down, to take, if we will use the word, the fight to the powers that be when the powers to be are corrupt. We must bear witness to the love. We must bear witness to courage. We must bear witness to mercy, forgiveness, compassion, patience. Jesus is our example. Jesus is the way we are to live, even if it risks everything for us. Some of us will remember the name of Oscar Romero, a Salvadorian Catholic priest who tirelessly stood out, and his life had been threatened many times. He'd been told by actually the Archbishop just to quiet down. He said, something's going to happen to you. And yes, it's been almost 45 years ago that he was assassinated while offering Mass in the hospital chapel. But people who had experienced his life testified that his life emboldened theirs and changed their lives. They knew he loved him, that he cared for them, and that he was willing to risk even his life for them. One even said, before we were not, now we are. So what happened on this day all those years ago is that Jesus shows us that perfect love casts out fear. And we remember this day how painfully aware, how easy it is to be less than fully human. And as we look at Jesus on the cross, as horrifying as that is, we can see the effects of our failure to lead lives of love and compassion. And we're forced to look at the hardness of our own hearts to see how easily we are distracted from the pain of the world while we tend simply to ourselves. What happened on this day all those years ago is that Jesus gives us an opportunity to see perfect love was snuffed out by fear, greed, and corruption. And isn't it our hope that our hearts and lives will be changed evermore to look like his? Even the hardest of hearts can be softened when his love is witnessed. Imagine, and perhaps it's happened to you, when someone stands up for you, someone sticks up for you, someone fights for you, someone sacrifices for you, that changes us. We see that we matter. We feel loved. We feel cared for. Again, as we look at Jesus on the cross, we may even be, for a first time, become aware that we are forgiven and given the chance to change. We're given the opportunity to grow in love and compassion. We can be, because we are redeemed. We are set free because of this day, Good Friday. Amen.